Welcome to the Road to Accountable AI. I'm Kevin Werbach, Professor of Legal Studies and Business Ethics at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. For decades, I've studied emerging technologies from broadband to blockchain. Today, artificial intelligence promises to transform our world. But AI won't reach its potential without accountability, mechanisms to ensure it's deployed in responsible, safe, and trustworthy ways. On this podcast, I speak with the experts leading the charge for accountable AI. AI is global, and major countries around the world are taking distinctive approaches to AI regulation. The United Kingdom is particularly interesting and I think underappreciated. Its policies are developing both in the aftermath of the Brexit divorce from the European Union and more recently a shift in government in the UK from the Conservative to the Labour Party. In this episode, I speak with Jessica Leonard, Chief Strategy and External Affairs Officer at the UK's Competition and Markets Authority, which, as you'll hear, is a key agency in the UK government addressing AI issues. Before joining the CMA in 2023, Jessica served in a number of positions in the private sector, including Senior Director for Global Data and AI Initiatives at Visa. She gives a fascinating look at the approaches the UK is taking to AI policy, not just as a means of mitigating harms, but also as part of its economic growth agenda. Jessica, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me on the Road to Accountable AI.
Hi, Kevin. Great to be with you.
First, for those who aren't in the UK or familiar with the system there, what exactly is the Competition and Markets Authority and what is it to do with AI policy?
That's a very good question. Telling me all your listeners don't already know who the CMA is. So we are the UK Competition and Markets Authority. We are the primary competition and consumer protection authority for the UK. So that's obviously a little different to the system you guys have in the US with the DOJ and the FTC. We are two for one. We are part of the UK government, but we have independent, evidence-led decision-making. Now, our mandate comes from the UK Parliament. There's a mandate for us to promote competition within and outside of the UK for the benefit of consumers. That's what the legislation says. And we have a very clear purpose as well, which is our sort of North Star as an organization, and that is to promote competitive markets and to tackle unfair behavior. And we do that for the benefit of people, businesses, and the UK economy. Now, I will talk a little bit about the kind of context in which we're doing that in the UK, and then I'll come on to the question around AI. So we have a new government here in the UK, a new Labour government, and we are having a big conversation at the moment about growth in the UK, economic growth. We have a new national mission, which is a critical priority for the new government to drive that growth that we all want to see across our economy. Now, for the CMA, growth has been a core pillar of our strategy for the last couple of years. So our incoming CEO and chair, when they came in early 2023, launched a new strategy for the CMA. And productive and sustainable growth across the whole UK economy is a core pillar of that strategy. So that's really front and center of the way we're thinking about everything that we do at the moment. How can we drive that growth, the investment, the innovation, the productivity that we need in the UK economy right now? So let me kind of come on to how we're thinking about AI. So look, we are living, I think it's fair to say, in a state of permanent technology revolution these days. It's very exciting, very disruptive. And AI is really at the forefront of that. We are really enthusiastic at the CMA about the potential opportunities that offers. We think you have to lean into that, not just because it has to play a critical part in growth, but also because ultimately what it could lead to is greater prosperity, a transformation for the better in the way that we live and work. So we're very, very excited about that. Our role within that is to make sure that opportunity is fully realized, making sure that competition is foundational to that, right? We've seen time and again, history and evidence has shown us that competition can play a foundational role in that innovation, in that productivity and driving that investment, unleashing that growth. So for us, that's really foundational to what we're trying to do in AI.
But what can regulators actually do to promote a domestic AI ecosystem?
I sense some skepticism in your tone. So look, I think firstly, there's a big picture piece to all of this, right? AI is an ecosystem; it's a big value chain, and different regulators will look at different pieces of that. But the big picture is very, very important, right? I think you've got to look upstream at the infrastructure. What are the kind of big ticket pieces, the critical inputs we need to build models, um, and then I think you've got to look downstream at that deployment and release layer, and even below that, at kind of talent, skills, how technology diffuses across an economy. All of that is incredibly important. And there are different bits of regulation which might apply, even things like planning, immigration, utilities. It's all kind of got a role to play. So there's a big picture piece. Um, I think, if we're realistic about the UK playing a real role here, becoming a real global leader, I think we have to understand, and the CMA is very emphatic about this, that means a role for companies of all shapes and sizes, right? From the largest players who've powered a huge amount of innovation and and investment in this space, through to the scrappy startups and challengers, the specialist providers, and of course that huge, fantastic, committed AI ecosystem of researchers and academics, ethicists. Everyone has got a part to play there. Um, if I come back to the CMA and our role and our remit, which is, of course, competition, again, we think competition can be absolutely foundational to unleashing these opportunities. And it's not just specific to AI. Right. History and evidence over a very long time tell us that competition has the power to do this, right? To unlock that innovation and all those benefits from markets. So I'll give you just sort of four ways in which that happens. The first is around bringing down barriers to entry and having a level playing field. If you're a business thinking about, starting up or scaling up in a market, right? You need to know that you're able to do that, right? In a fair way. You've got a fair shot at success, that level playing field. If you're going to risk your capital, right, get into something, that level playing field is there. And of course, that matters for investors too, right? You've got to put your money where you think you're going to get a fair return, and that level playing field instills confidence in investors. I think when they're making those bets. Secondly, it's in everybody's interests that the products and services we have, are as good as they can possibly be. You want companies to succeed on the merits. You want there to be a continuous cycle of improvement, and competition is the fire, right, to the feet of companies to make sure that they do that. Thirdly, and I think this is also very important, for the small minority of bad actors to be held accountable so that the vast majority of fair dealing businesses have confidence, right, in that fair shot. That has to work, right? And that's also part of competition enforcement. And then finally, choice, right? Who doesn't like choice? As consumers and businesses, of course, it's important to have that choice, right? But again, that diversity of choice, competition can underpin that, not just because it helps consumers and businesses, but also there's quite a fundamental point there around economic resilience. So a resilient economy, one that is, able to withstand shocks and volatility and, goodness, that's definitely the world we live in these days, is one in which you have diversity of supply. We saw that through COVID. We see it increasingly. So competition helps to prop up that diversity of supply so that you're not vulnerable to those single points of failure. And I just want to come back to kind of regulation
Mhm.
outside of the CMA for a moment and make 2 points. I think the first of those is, as I said at the beginning, there's lots of different areas of regulation that need to be involved here, right? This is a general purpose technology. It's going to impact every part of our society and economy. So join up is incredibly important. We'll come on to talk more about how that works in practice later on. And secondly, regulation should not be the grit in the system, right? In an innovation-led industry like this. That's absolutely fatal, right? So you need to make sure you're designing it and considering it in ways which understand and take into account the way that innovation-led, fast-moving industries like this work. So the new government actually here in the UK has just brought in something called the Regulatory Innovation Office. I think this is really exciting. It's a specific part of government set up to analyze regulation in these sort of innovation-led industries and try and work out where it can help and where it's hindering and address that. So I think that's very positive.
So, how exactly are you tackling those challenges?
Well, I think it's interesting. Again, if I come back to what not to do in some senses, right? We hear this from companies all the time, and I worked in the corporate world the vast majority of my career before coming to the CMA. So I know this to be true, that poorly designed, heavy-handed, kind of overbearing regulation really does have the potential to stymie innovation and growth. And that is not the outcome that the CMA is looking for at all, quite the opposite. So the approach that we've taken after doing that research and publishing those reports that I mentioned a moment ago is a principles-based approach. So we've got 6 principles that we developed in collaboration with that big stakeholder group that I mentioned, consulted on those a lot, and we published the final version of those with our April report. So those I can run down for you a little bit. There's a lot of detail about these available, but I'll give you a quick kind of top line. So the first one is access, the ongoing and ready access to the critical inputs that we know are required to build, develop these models. So things like data, things like compute, things like access to talent. The second one is diversity. So we spoke about diversity a moment ago. The benefits of that diversity in the models that are available, right? Open source, closed source, different capabilities. We want to see that diversity maintained. And that leads me into the third principle, which is choice. We want the end users and the business customers to have real choice here, not just of the different models, but, being able to switch across different ecosystems. We don't want to see any kind of lock in there at all. The fourth one is fair dealing. So it's incredibly important in these ecosystems, right? Where lots of companies of different shapes and sizes have relationships with one another. And, some of those smaller companies really depend on those big ecosystems, that there is a principle of fair dealing there. We don't want to be seeing anti-competitive behavior, like anti-competitive tying, bundling, self-preferencing, that kind of lock-in. And then 2, which are slightly different. So transparency and accountability. Now, transparency, by that, we really mean, do end users and business customers have enough information to understand the risks and the limitations of these models? And accountability, this is really on, the firms developing and deploying to make sure that they're behaving responsibly, that they're accountable, and that they're upholding that trust, which we know is so incredibly important in this space. So that's kind of the approach that we've taken, not the heavy-handed regulation, but a principles-based approach. And we've been working with that ecosystem on these principles since we published them. And I have to say the response has been great. We've been urging companies to embed these into their business practices. And one of the largest firms, who shall remain nameless, told us recently they thought these principles were the best thing to come out of an antitrust authority last year. So we'll take that.
Fantastic. You talked very powerfully earlier about the value of competition in AI, but at least to date, what we've seen, especially for foundation models, is a great deal of concentration, really, at every layer of the stack. So is there a viable pathway towards more competition?
I'm going to say yes, because we would be quite an unambitious competition authority if we had a different answer, but it happens to be true, I think. Again, let's kind of look down the stack a bit. So in that, those critical inputs that I talked about a moment ago, I think it's very fair to say that the largest companies are very well positioned here. They have extremely deep pockets, which is what some of these sort of big ticket items require. And I think it's also important to recognize the contribution they've made here, actually, to R&D, to investment, to talent. They've been absolute engines of that stuff. So, that's, I think, very important to recognize. Does that mean there is not also a role for the smaller players? No, I think very, very much there is, right? And it's also the CMA's job to make sure that materializes. And I think it's very, when you look at the last couple of years, right, the sort of curve jumping innovation we've seen, some of the most innovative and capable models have actually come from the smaller players, models that are now, becoming quite quickly household names, Claude, Perplexity, OpenAI. Even my mom knows now what Perplexity is. So I make sure she's quite tech savvy. But, but I think what that kind of shows you is that there really is kind of room for everybody here, as long as we do keep in mind and really try to take seriously the principles that I just mentioned. Now, of course, competition is what underpins the sustainability of what I've just described, right? Um, that kind of diversity in the ecosystem and that healthy tension that keeps companies competing with one another, right? The large ones with one another, and you do see that increasingly in space too, as well as the smaller ones. So our job is very much to try and safeguard and enhance that, right? Um, I think there is also a layer down, in the deployment and release layer that I'll come to talk a little bit more about competition there when I talk about the new Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act in the UK. But I do also just want to sort of come back a bit to the question of how is this possible? How are we going to maintain these things? And the piece I talked about a moment ago in terms of regulation. If we are able to keep moving in the right direction, right, to keep this diversity, to keep this kind of competitive rivalry going, what that kind of helps you avoid is needing to unpick, some of this stuff later on down the line when harms have potentially become really entrenched. So early action, working together to do that can actually help avoid some of the sort of more disruptive type of interventions, right? The sort of regulation that we know companies don't want layered on top of yet more regulation. So we think there's a very positive way to move forward, as an ecosystem on all of this and hopefully prevent those problems from becoming entrenched and requiring, more costly, more disruptive intervention later on.
How do you develop the kinds of internal capacity and expertise, though, that you need to address such a technologically sophisticated area?
It's a very, very good question. And again, coming from the private sector, I've been astonished at how well the CMA does this. They really did get ahead of the game in doing this. So in 2019, we set up our data technology and insights unit. And this is now an 80 strong multidisciplinary cross CMA function. It's absolutely fantastic. We've got data scientists, data engineers, e-discovery, forensics, behavioral scientists, and of course, increasingly lawyers and economists and policy folk as well, kind of, all really embedded in this. So it's a fantastic capability. I'll say 80 again, just in case any of your listeners misheard and thought I said 800 or 8,000. Um, but nonetheless, 80, I think, puts us really at the forefront of these sort of capabilities for comparable authorities around the world. And it is incredibly important to have that, right? These are complicated, fast moving markets. So the onus is on us to make sure we really know what we're doing in this space. Now, it's not enough for us just to be doing that internally. The second piece that I would really emphasize is you don't learn unless you listen with something as technical and complicated as this. So that stakeholder engagement I've been talking about is really important. So Sarah Cardell, when she came in as CEO, she's made a very, very conscious push for the CMA to be really listening, engaging more than we have ever engaged with companies. We have a much more open door policy now for companies of all shapes and sizes to come and talk to us, explain their business models, understand us and our processes. And I would really urge companies to do that, actually. That's something we're very, very committed to. For that listening and engaging. Also, we've got kind of, ancillary experience here, which serves us in very good stead. So the work we've done around mobile ecosystems, around digital advertising, around cloud, online choice architecture, I talked about dark patterns. Some of this is, market studies and some of it is really in-depth investigation. Some is research, but there's a really rich kind of body of expertise and experience that has been built up over quite a significant number of years now, which we bring to bear when we look at things like AI.
Are there any open investigations or enforcement proceedings in the U.S., for example? The Federal Trade Commission has an investigation ongoing of OpenAI. Is there anything similar happening in the UK?
So we've thought very carefully across what we call our toolkit, the sort of suite of our powers, and it does work a little differently here than it does in the US. So we've kind of thought across the suite of what we have available to us. So I'll give you kind of a bit of a rundown of what we've been doing and thinking about. So firstly, we've been doing the research and the reports that I mentioned earlier, and that kind of ecosystem engagement. We're looking at AI through the lens of our markets work. So we have this quite cool tool here in the UK called a market investigation. This is a really in-depth look at a market led by an independent group of experts. So this is a really forensic, evidence-led process. So we have our crowd market investigation open at the moment, and we have said that we will, as part of that, be considering the impact of foundation models on competition in cloud services. So that's kind of one way that we can look at these things. And yes, we have a mergers tool, and we've been kind of thinking about AI in the context of that as well. So just to sort of frame that a little bit and bring us back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the CMA's role. So again, when we're looking at all of this in the round, we're thinking about how can we as a competition authority unlock that opportunity of the AI for the UK, right? How can competition underpin growth in these markets? And we're also thinking about that duty I talked about, which is given to us by Parliament to promote competition within and outside of the UK for the benefit of consumers. So with both of those in mind, we have been taking a look at a handful of partnerships that have been taking place across the AI ecosystem between some of the largest players and some of those smaller players that I spoke about earlier. And, some of those deals are a little complex and a little opaque. It's not immediately obvious with some of them what's going on. So we look at that through with two questions in mind, which are based on how merger law works here in the UK. So the first of those is, do we have jurisdiction to look at the deal? Does it constitute a deal under UK merger law? And secondly, does it really raise competition concerns? Do we think there's likelihood of a substantial lessening of competition in the UK? So that's kind of the frame through which we've been looking at these deals. Now, when I say looking at them, what that tends to mean is we have a phase one process, which is really a sort of information and evidence gathering process that gives the parties themselves the opportunity to submit documents, and they do a lot. But also third parties, anyone can kind of submit evidence to this process. It will all be looked at in the round by experts within the CMA. So we've been running through this handful of cases in I think, a very timely and efficient way, looking at that evidence. And as we go, we've been really striving to give greater clarity. We've been ourselves kind of hoping to get greater clarity around the sorts of deals that do and don't meet the two criteria that I spoke about earlier. And also, we've been publishing very fulsome decisions. Not every authority around the world publishes a full decision if it's a clearance, right? We do that. So we've been really trying to unpack our thinking in there because we know how important it is for businesses, right, to have that clarity, especially investors. So we've been really trying to do that. I think it's also worth just sort of noting for context here that around 50,000 M&A deals were announced last year. And the CMA looked at 913. And 95% of those didn't even proceed to an investigation, let alone an intervention of some kind. And in fact, just one was prohibited. So it's quite useful to keep those sort of figures in mind.
What do you see as the major open issues or open questions right now for AI policy?
So, we've talked about the competition piece quite a lot. So let me sort of move away from that and talk about another couple of issues that I think, should be on everybody's radar. So the first one of those is the other half of our remit, which is consumer protection. This is very much in everyone's minds. I'm sure that it is with yours, given the name of your podcast. As I say, algorithmic harms have been, something on our minds for some time. And, the report that we put out in April also looked quite in depth at the propensity of AI to exacerbate those harms. Now, we also know that AI has incredible potential to do fantastic things, right, for consumers. But I think we want to be thoughtful about those two principles I mentioned of the CMA's, transparency and accountability, particularly in this context. I think it's incredibly important. Secondly, I think AI safety is a big one, right, that, we should talk more about. This is one which is kind of, catapulted up the political agenda for good reasons in the last couple of years, and I think it's extremely important that we maintain the global momentum that we have now behind this. And then the other piece I would sort of add on a little bit is what I talked about at the beginning in terms of all of the different areas of regulation that need to work together here, right? So it's quite easy, I think, for all of us in AI to lose sight of the bigger picture. But you hear a lot these, at the moment around energy, for example, and the importance of that within the AI ecosystem. We know that it's incredibly important that infrastructure and planning work in the right way in order to facilitate the growth of these industries. So there's a big suite of policy issues there.
You mentioned earlier the DMCCA, the UK Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act, which is different from the Digital Markets Act, the DMA in the European Union. So could you say a little bit more about how that legislation impacts your authority and ability to address these kinds of issues?
It is different. It is different, and I think it's worth noting that whilst authorities all over the world are taking different approaches to this, many of the principles are the same, right? I think there's been a broad acknowledgement that for an innovation-led, fast-paced markets like digital, the sort of regulation that we had for quite a long time just wasn't going to cut it. Right? So different places around the world have been developing their own kind of responses to that. And the digital markets competition and consumer regime in the UK is ours. We like to think that it is a very, very well designed and unique piece of regulation. There's a few features which make it so, and I'll talk to you about those again. But coming back to the principle I described earlier about how competition can unleash and unlock growth, and investment. This is also the basis for this piece of regulation. The idea here is to maximize the opportunities to grow a UK tech sector, right? And that's incredibly exciting. So that should mean that opportunities for the largest companies remain, right? They play an incredibly important role in these digital markets, and that should remain. But it means that the CMA will also have an ability to protect and enhance opportunities for the smaller players, right? For those scrappy startups, for the challengers, right? To come in and have that fair shot that I talked about earlier. And it should also mean fantastic opportunities for consumers and business customers, right? To get great choices and fair deals. So that's kind of the framing context for this. We're hoping it's going to be genuinely a new era in digital growth for the UK economy. So how is it going to do that exactly? So it is supposed to apply to only a very small number of the very largest firms. So those firms will have what's called strategic market status. So this is a bit legalistic, but effectively what it means is they will have a substantial and entrenched position in one or more digital markets in the UK. Now we haven't made any provisional decisions yet about where we're going to focus those investigations. But what I can talk about a bit is the principles and the process underpinning the way that this regulation will work and why we think it's so special and why we think it should be extremely attractive, actually, to businesses and investors in the way that it operates. So first of all, it's designed to be very tailored and bespoke. It's not a big sweeping one-size-fits-all piece of regulation. We think that's really, really important for the reasons that I've described earlier. Instead, what it allows us to do is really target specific harms with tailored solutions, working iteratively with the companies in a participative conversation that involves the whole ecosystem, right, a wide range of stakeholders, so that the interventions we're making really are targeted to exactly that problem, all right? And it allows us to be quite sort of iterative and bespoke in the way that we're doing it, and very proportionate as well. This is a truly different approach to what I think we see in other pieces of equivalent regulation. And certainly, this is something that we think is going to be very attractive, actually, to businesses, and certainly we hope to the consumers that will also benefit from all of this. Now, AI is a consideration within that. We've kind of talked about that a little bit. How that might work in practice, for example, is where AI is is part of one of the critical inputs that we might look at in one of those digital activities. So, cloud, for example. Equally, in that deployment layer that I said I'd come back to, when you're looking at things like mobile ecosystems, search, productivity software, these are all potential avenues for foundation models to be deployed and released across the economy. that is also something that we can look at through the lens of this regulation.
So last question, the UK hosted a major high-level AI safety summit in late 2023 that resulted in a international declaration signed by, I think, 28 different countries around AI policy. Um, to what extent do you think there is potential going forward for truly global governance of this phenomenon, given how global the technology is?
Very good question. It makes me feel a little tired when you ask it like that. I mean, in my previous job, I had a big glass wall. And on that glass wall, every time I found a new AI ethics or governance framework, I would just note it down. And I ran out of wall quickly, quite quickly. So when you think about kind of global harmonization, yes, it seems a long way off. And to an extent, there are good reasons for that, right? Nations are sovereign in terms of the legal frameworks that they have and the decisions that they take. Different countries are at different stages of technological development. They have different social norms. That I think is understandable and healthy. I think when you think about an issue like this, and you look at the sort of existential risks that were discussed at Bletchley and in those sorts of conversations, it is eminently important that we do have that sort of global consensus and global conversation. I think Bletchley was incredibly important in that, and it's fantastic that that conversation is continuing around the world. Um, from a competition perspective, we're a really active part of our international community talking about these things. So, groups like the G7 just issued a communique last month on a commitment in this area. Equally, we put out a joint statement over the summer with the FTC, the DOJ, and the European Commission around upholding competition and consumer protection in the AI space. So we can all be doing that, and continuing to kind of share best practice to support one another in terms of understanding and sharing the kind of capabilities and expertise that you need in this space. These are borderless markets, right? And we live in a very globally interconnected world. So those relationships are strong already. They've been getting stronger over the last several decades, and I think they will continue to strengthen around an issue like AI. Um, I mean, it's interesting. We were talking earlier about the different approaches, even, to digital regulation being taken around the world. In the EU now, they have a big AI Act. In the US, I know it's kind of a bit of a fragmented picture. Last I heard, California's got 32 AI laws of its own. Yeah. And here in the UK, as I say, CMA is kind of taking this principles-based approach. Government's approach is kind of look at this through the lens of sectoral regulation primarily, and then it has the AI safety work as a kind of different strand, and it will be bringing forward an AI safety bill within this parliament. So all of these different approaches, I hope, add up to some alignment on the need for real action in this space. But true harmonization, I think we may need to come back in a few years and do another podcast on that.
Well, that's all right. Covered a lot, and this is a very fast-moving area. Jessica, really appreciate your taking the time to speak with me.
Not at all. Thanks so much, Kevin.
This has been The Road to Accountable AI. If you like what you're hearing, please give us a good review and check out my Substack for more insights on AI accountability. Thank you for listening.
This is Kevin Werbach. If you want to go deeper on AI governance, trust, and responsibility with me and other distinguished faculty of the world's top business school, sign up for the next cohort of Wharton's Strategies for Accountable AI online executive education program, featuring live interaction with faculty, expert interviews, and custom-designed asynchronous content. Join fellow business leaders to learn valuable skills you can put to work in your organization. Visit execed.wharton.upenn.edu/ACAI for full details. I hope to see you there.